Okay, so we are live now. And so let me go ahead and introduce the speaker today. We are hearing from Tobias Wieland. Yeah. And I just want to note before we get started that I will be editing the YouTube videos. They're still up on YouTube now, and I'll be editing them to put the titles of the talks, the speaker for each video. Right now, it just says Hegel and Dialetheism 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's probably harder to find specific talks and topics. So I will edit that over the next 2 weeks. So Tobias, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Greg, and also Graham and Elena for organizing this series of colloquiums, which is a very helpful context to test my own reading on Hegel. Let me briefly say something on myself. I did my PhD this year, defended this April, and it was a reading and interpretation of Hegel's doctrine of the absolute, but I come from the tradition of critical theory. So I do metaphysics, but from kind of a Frankfurtian point of view. So this is kind of my perspective. And out of this broader framework of what I did in my PhD, I will now present something on this question, which is put here. It's that question of dialetheism and the very question of method, or in Hegelian terms, the question of dialectics. So this is what I will do in the following. And I'm very happy to receive your critical questions after the talk, but I think it's better to kind of go through this line of thinking and then get into the Q&A. So what it is all about today, like I said, it's on this systematic relation that I see between dialetheism and dialectics. So to start with, I like to propose some definitions, which are rather uncontroversial, I guess. First, I understand by dialectics a method, which is to say the method of speculative logics, or we could also speak of scientific metaphysics. Then we've got two different conceptions of truth. First one is dialetheism, according to which we can say that contradictions they are constitutive for the idea of life of the concept, or we could also speak of contradictions to be necessary but not sufficient. So by this, I take this to be the core claim of dialetheism. Whereas aletheism is also a theory of truth, but indicating that contradictions are flaws of thought. So in order to overcome these flaws, we have to undertake theoretical movement, which is then to aim at resolving contradictions analytically. And I take this to be the standard view on what Hegel means by Aufhebung. So in other words, my question of today is how to understand Aufhebung based on dialetheism. So what is a dialectic understanding of Aufhebung? That's the question of today. Let me start then with two objections. And I think there are two sorts of objections to dialetheism. First one of them is systematic. So the systematic objections can be spelled out in reference to Aristotle's. I think this is the standard interpretation, locus classicus. Aristotle in his metaphysics holds that it is impossible for the same attribute at once to belong and not to belong to the same thing in the same relation. This later has been qualified as the ex falso quodlibet, so which is to say that if A and non-A, or A and non-A in one sentence would be logically permissible, then we can infer whatsoever, which is to say that the distinction of substance and accident would implode if we would allow for A and non-A to be logically permissible. There is a second sort of systematic objections, which I tried to address in this talk, which I called the locus neoclassicus. This is to be found in Popper, in the Open Societies, but also in other books, where he says that if we are prepared, like Hegel is in his point of view, to put up with contradictions, then criticism, and with it, all intellectual progress must come to an end. And I take this to be the claim on the necessity of LNC, the law of non-contradiction, for criticism. So if A and not A would be permissible, then I would have kind of an easy way out if my commitment to A is put in question, because I also claim that non-A to be the case. So the criticism of my position would be impossible if and only if A and non-A would be permissible. So these two objections will guide me through my interpretive or interpretation on Hegel, because they are also interpretive, and this is the second sort of objections to dialetheism. They are interpretive objections to dialetheism in Hegel, and I will very briefly touch upon them by presenting a metaphor which I found in the secondary literature, especially Jim Crane's books on Hegel's metaphysics. There I find a metaphor which I find helpful to kind of as an abbreviation to all these elitistic readings of Hegel, which is the metaphor of Wittgenstein's ladder. In the very end of the Tractatus, we find that quotation that we have to leave behind all this nonsense through which the Tractatus had us guided through. And so once we reach the very final step, we can throw the ladder away, which we had to use in order to climb up. And I think this is kind of an analogy or metaphor, which is often in the secondary literature used to kind of spell out the idea of the process of conceptual analysis. So we have all these contradictory claims such as being and nothing. And so we kind of use them to move upon the next level. And once we reach becoming, we can leave behind nothing and being. So this is kind of the analogy that I see very often used in elitic understanding of Hegel's. So I'm addressing and criticizing these two objections. So in order to do so, in order to defend dialetheism in Hegel, both systematically and also interpretively, I'd like to start with a quotation which comes from the very end of the Subjective Logics. So this is 8 pages before its very end, which is where he says, the firm principle that formal thinking lays down for itself here is that contradictions or the contradiction cannot be thought. But in fact, the thought of contradictions is the essential moment of the concept. So as this comes from the very end of the logics, so this is right within the absolute idea, I don't see grounds for having this latter idea in mind when it comes to the idea of what is conceptual progress. So I don't think that it is fair and that it has so much contextual evidence to hold that Hegel would think of the distinction of substance and accident, as well as the idea of criticism and progress. I don't think that Hegel would hold that they would presuppose LNC. So this is a very systematic question, how to gain space for both criticism and progress, and also to understand the distinction of substance and accidents without having to rely upon LNC. So instead of leaving contradictions behind, I think we shall consider them as essential for the concept. So this raises a question, because normally, if we think of contradictions to be what indicates formal truth, and we reject LNC, then we have to ask a question, which is, what is conceptual form? Right? If consistency is not conceptual form as such, what then is conceptual form? The answer is given by Hegel in saying that it is a method. So what is left to be considered here means in the very end, the absolute idea is thus not a content as such, but the universal character of its form, the conceptual form of content, and that is method. So this is the starting point from which I like to go into details. Oops, what's going on in here? So I think we have to understand method as what he spells out in the absolute idea, or in other words, the absolute idea is nothing else than the answer to the question, what is method? So in the beginning of the Subjective Logics, in the preface, he says that it is clear that no exposition can be accepted as scientifically valid that do not follow the progression of this, which is to say the dialectic method, and it is not in tune with its simple rhythm, for it is the curse of the fact itself. So I take dialectics to mean something very substantial, which is to say dialectics is kind of the rhythm of life and thinking. So life and thinking, they are both dialectic in their rhythm. So what Di Giovanni translates here as the curse of the fact itself, we find this in the original as saying der Gang der Sache selbst. So Gang could also be translated as the pace, the pace of the matter at hand. So everything is a movement, and as such, it has a certain rhythm, and this rhythm is dialectics. So the very idea, I translate this, is to say in my translation that the very idea of the isomorphy or the isomorphic relation of being and thinking, or I will speak from now on of objectivity and subjectivity. So the isomorphic relationship of objectivity and subjectivity lies in their capacity for self-motion, which is to say that self-motion is the tertium comparationis of subjectivity and objectivity. They both are identical as self-motive, but they differ in the modality of self-motion. So self-motion allows us to see and bridge the gap of subjectivity and objectivity, and also to be able to spell out their very difference. So this is what I think is the first step. And this leads to what I would like to call Hegel's counterintuitive conceptualism, because the sufficient reason why everything is alive is that it behaves conceptually, which is to say that the rhythm of life and thinking has a certain score, and this score is the method, or this is the dialectical method, and that score starts, and this is kind of familiar to many of you, I think, starts with the first step, the analytical moment. So we kind of abstract from the relational character and just look at the thing as such. We look at the constitutive elements of its identity, and we abstract from the self-referential character of everything that there is. So by this, we reach at what Hegel calls the immediateness. This is the first step. Then the second one is to relate this item as such to its other. So we have to come up with a theory or a systematization of its relational character. This is the second step, which is by Hegel called this the synthesis, the synthetical moment of thinking. And then we have to go back, so to speak, to what Hegel calls the restored immediateness, which is then the dialectical movement back to the identity and difference. And this is what I think what the speculative character is all about. So this is the pace, right? Identity, difference, and the unity of these two. This is the score of life, so to speak. This conceptual idealism has, from my point of view, two implications, and I think I need to defend them in what follows. But I think it's helpful to address them explicitly and to name them. So the first implication is in regard to what we mean by the absolute. So I think we shall not understand the absolute on rather Platonic terms, which is to say the absolute is not the ultimate reality of the sphere of unchanging ideas. I think the argument for this is plain, because if the ultimate reality would be opposed to the empirical sphere of change, then the inference from this would be to say that the absolute would be very finite. So in order to understand the absolute as infinite, we have to see that transformation is a constitutive feature of the absolute. And this brings us back to the idea of self-motion. I'd like to propose that absolute can be understood as the capacity for self-motion on its own, but in relation to its other. So this has a second implication, which is to say that self-motion shall not be understood as a given feature, or we could also speak of positivity, which is then to be just received by the subject, but something different. Self-motion, or Kant might speak of spontaneity, is not only a feature of subjectivity. Everything that is alive holds both. It holds both predicates. It is both spontaneous and receptive. So which is to say, and this brings us back to the idea of the identity and difference of subject and object, we need to identify the different modalities of self-motion in order to differentiate objectivity from subjectivity. So because we cannot say that only the subject would be self-motive and the object not, because this is too plain, this is too abstract. We need to see that both are alive, and that is to say that both are spontaneous and receptive. But the way how they are in motive, this is what differentiate them. So this is what I try to spell out in the following. I think it's and now I come to some historical remark, but very briefly, I think the claim that subjectivity makes a huge contribution to understanding the metaphysical questions, I take this to be an affirmation of the very idea of modernity. The modernity for Hegel is the affirmation of the principle of subjectivity. And this is what comes very good to the fore if we have a look on his lectures on the history of philosophy, where he speaks of Descartes. Because for him, Descartes is the first one to kind of come up with an understanding of subjectivity, which is modern, still abstract and still to be developed, but we've got what he calls a fresh start. So we come for the first time, this is what he says in the lectures, to what is properly called the philosophy of the modern world. And we begin with Descartes. So I like this quotation where he says, here we might say, we are at home, and like the sailor after long voyage, we can shout out, land ho, Land in Sicht in the original. And so this is this very fresh start. And so Descartes kind of overcame the naivete of ancient thinking by exposing the ontological status of subjectivity in his notion of res cogitans. And in order to see this lineage or this heritage of rationalism in Hegel, I think it's helpful to differentiate, and we have been touching upon this issue many times during our discussions in the previous weeks, that I think it's helpful to actually differentiate realism from actualism, yeah? Which is to say that both are identical in the sense that they both are conceptions of objectivity. But whereas realism holds that objectivity is constituted as such, we have to understand this by saying that substance and accidents are essentially determined in themselves. They are what they are regardless of their perception, so to speak. We can think of actualism to play out the idea of the interdependency of objectivity and subjectivity. And which is, from my point of view, to say that reflection is part of substance, which is to say that reflection is part of the ontological fabric of the world. So the thesis of the interdependency commits us to come up with an understanding of reflection as not merely subjective. Yeah. So this is what I take Kant to be doing in regard to Descartes' rationalism. So the idea of res cogitans and res extensor is kind of specified in Kant's transcendental idealism, because Kant differentiates appearance in the sense of Erscheinung and reality as Ding an sich. So this is the Copernican turn. The subjective conditions of the experience of things are the conditions of the things of objective experience. So we kind of prefigure, so to speak, what comes to us to the fore, but this kind of also differentiates us from the Ding an sich. So we live in the world of Erscheinung. This is a big question on how this is to be interpreted. I think it's fair to understand Kant to have a claim for realism. So Erscheinung is not mere Erscheinung, it's reality, but still there is this interplay. And this interplay of subjectivity and objectivity is what Hegel takes up, but in a very critical and different way. Because I take Hegel to be claiming that his idealism is kind of a radicalization of Kant's move, but he refutes its transcendental limits. And which is to say that Hegel has a different understanding of the difference between appearance, shine, and objectivity or actuality, Wirklichkeit. So it's kind of the same project, the interplay of objectivity and subjectivity, but it's done in a different way. And this brings us now to the doctrine of essence. Like I said, we are committed to come up with an interpretation of the ontological status of reflection. So reflection is part of the fabric of the world. So what does that mean? Yeah, and I think the place where Hegel spells this out is the doctrine of essence. Here is something This has lots of implications, what I'm going to say now, for the debate on the Kant-Hegel relationship. And it will be very short, what I'm going to say now. It's just that I think it's helpful to think of Kant to be a pre-Hegelian instead of think of Hegel as a post-Kantian. So this is my kind of my way of doing this. But I'd like to spell this out by saying that Kant has three critiques, and the speculative Kant, this is the Kant that is of interest for Hegel, is the Kant of the first and the third critique. So many scholars on Kant, they think of the third critique to be kind of, old guy going crazy sort of thing. I think the third critique plays a substantial role in Kantianism. But this is also to strengthen the speculative moments in Kant. So, as you all will know, in the first critique, Kant distinguishes Verstand and Vernunft. Both are capacities, whereas the capacities of understanding, Verstand, is the capacity to follow a conceptual rule in order to unify what is empirically given through the senses to the manifold into one appearance. This is Verstand, and Vernunft is another capacity, familiar but different. It is the capacity of reason for predication and critical relating a conceptual rule to another. So we've got this unified manifoldness, then we relate them to another. So the question of how to place the third critique within the Kantian framework is the question on where to put the power of reflexive judgment, whether or not it is a third capacity, how it is to be mapped within this Kantian framework. And I think what is rather consensual is to say that in theoretical practices, so in thinking, what we do is, this is a functional analysis, this is not a chronological order. We have different functions. The first function is that we follow a rule by sorting particulars under a universal. This is rather the idea of subordinating something under a given universal. This is Verstand. We've got, secondly, the function of relating, the relation of subjects of predication to another. This is Vernunft. And now the third one is the reflexive judgment, which is to articulate the universal as expressed in the particular. And Kant holds here that the idea of exemplary validity, which is paradigmatically to be found in the idea of beauty, is helpful to understand this function. So he holds in the third critique that the beautiful is the symbol for the ethically good. Yeah, das Schöne als Symbol des sittlich Guten. And so it's not bottom up like in subordination. It's not mere induction. It's kind of seeing the totality as contained within this singular. And this capacity is the third capacity, the power of reflexive judgment. So I think it's rather clear that Hegel takes up this Kantian framework in order to spell out his intuitive conception of reflection, which is to say the subjective dimension of thinking. The first one is understanding. So we compare what is given through the senses. We come up with analytic schematas, and we have this unrelational, rather atomistic idea of identity. So the second one is determinate reflection of reason. So this is the idea of relating again, but in their constitutive way. So it's not just such a contingent other, it's the very other, the constitutive other, but still in different relation. Last but not least, the idea of immanent reflection in spirit. This is the relation of contradictions, and this is what, according to Hegel, constitutes reciprocal affection. So it's an indifferent opposition. It's a more complex sort of relation. So this is what brings us to the next idea. The next idea is that there is also a counterintuitive conception of reflection, because, like I said, it's not only that reflection takes place within the subject, so to speak, it's also part of the ontological fabric of the world. And this ontological determination is what he kind of brings together in the Doctrine of Essence. That's why we have this overtly complex textual evidence that he kind of mixes up ontological and epistemological questions. But in order to see the counterintuitive, idea of reflection, the objective side, so to speak, I think it's rather clear that we can speak of identity and difference not in terms of absolute difference. So absolute difference is empty. So because it's a simple opposition. So we have to think of the identity as being only what it is through its relation to the other. So we have to say that difference entails itself and this reference equally. So difference is the whole and its own moment and its own moment. So this is a quotation. And I think this is to be regarded as the essential nature of reflection and as the determined primordial origin of all activity and self-movement. So the idea of this relation as being something that is not just a subjective contribution, but being constituted as part of the objectivity, I think this is what he tries to understand. And this is to say that identity and difference are relational determinations of existence. So there is no such a thing as mere identity. There is just a relation that we have, and the two moments of these relations are spelled out by identity and difference, but it is a dialectic relation because, as I quoted, he says of this identity and difference relation to be the whole. There was something missing. It is the whole and its own moment. So it's a part and the totality. So the identity is part of the totality, but it's also just the totality as in itself. The same holds for the difference. So it's kind of a dialectic relation. So what he does there in the Doctrine of Essence is what I take to be some sort of a typology of the different relations of relation. The identity difference relation is not just a relation. There are three different forms of relation. And this brings us now to Verschiedenheit, Gegensatz, and Widerspruch. These are what I like to propose to call the typology of differences, difference of differences. The first one is the simplest one, which is Verschiedenheit. I propose to bring this rather in a line to what classical logicians know as the contrarian negation, because we've got LNC in place, which is to say that from A, we can infer that it's not necessarily the case that non-B is the case, because A and non-B, they cannot be the case at the very same time. But there is the law of the excluded middle, which is not in touch, or which is not the case in mere contrarian negations, because there is a C or D possible, which is to say that from non-A, we cannot step to non-B, because it could be that neither A nor B are the case. And I think in Hegelian terms, this is to say that relations of diversity, they do not constitute a totality. They remain external to the latter, because it could be something completely else. So it's just the logical space, so to speak, is very open. It could be another item to come in, so to speak. It could be another respect in which we compare diversities. Yeah, so it's important, but it's not yet going to the matter at hand, so to speak. It's still very subjective. It's external. Äußerliche Reflexion. This is what he calls this in German. This is different in the second type of difference, which is Gegensatz or opposition. I think this is contradictory in this classical sense of the word, because we have something similar to diversity, which is the applicability of LNC. So still here from A, we cannot move on to necessarily non-A, but as the law of the excluded middle does apply, so there is no third given, there is only A and non-A. The fact that there is non-A is sufficient for the inference that necessarily A. So if non-A, then A, because there is no third given, right? Either or. So in this sense, oppositions, they do constitute a totality because they are internal to the relata of the relation. So, but it is a totality of indifferent differences, because A and non-A, positivity and negativity, this is his mathematical example, they remain what they are in this relation. They're in opposition, yeah, but they are kind of stable and fixed in this relationship. And this is what is different in the third type of difference. The third type of difference is what he calls contradiction. I find it helpful to call this concrete negation, but this is my own way of putting this. But I think the logics of concrete negation is here. And as LNC is not in place, so we can say that it is necessary of A and non-A to be the case. But I think the refutation of the law of excluded middle is also important. So we can not only say that A and non-A is the case, we also have to say that neither A nor non-A is equally true. So this is to say that it's the dynamics of that we want to understand. So A is only the case if non-A is the case, and this means that it's also true that as both are undergoing change, it's also true that we have to say that neither A nor non-A is true. So this is what I like to call a totality of concrete determinations. So the very question now is, what the heck do I mean by concreteness? Yeah, because concreteness now bears a heavy load, because it must this is what allows us to spell out the idea of contradictions. And I think it's clear that concreteness cannot mean something as external determination. It must be more inner, so to speak. And I'd like to speak of communication and reciprocal affection, Wechselwirkung. So this is the idea of concreteness. They don't remain what they are, they undergo change through this being in relation to another. So I own textual evidence to the talk of reciprocal affection, because this sounds to be rather un-Hegelian, but I do find this in Hegel. So in the beginning of the Subjective Logics, he says that the dialectical movement, the score of life and thinking, so to speak, the dialectical movement of substance throughout causality and reciprocal affection, and this is the translation of what Hegel himself calls the Wechselwirkung. This movement is the immediate genesis of the concept by virtue of which its becoming is displayed. So this is the textual evidence for bringing align the idea of concreteness to communication and reciprocal affection. So this commits us to say that the idea of communication is also the framework for understanding mechanical processes. So also for unorganic nature, it is true of thinking that they are only what they are through communication, but they are analyzed by Hegel as asymmetrical forms of communication. Yeah. So another quotation says that the communication, this is from the objectivity chapter in the Subjective Logics, the communication between material objects, thus their determinateness widen, so to speak, in an equally compared to spiritual communication in an equally idealizing manner, but personality is infinitively more intensive or more harder than objects. Yeah. So this is just to say that he is indeed using his talk on reciprocal affection of Wechselwirkung to understand mechanical processes, but also to come up with a theory why they are, in comparison to spiritual communication, rather abstract. Yeah. So everything exists only through communication. This is true for whatsoever, but spiritual forms of communication, they are more complex, they're more concrete. Henceforth, the mechanical relations are abstract. But it is also important to notice that regression is possible. So it is a regression to be treated mechanically as when I have spiritual capacities. So this is the dialectics of second nature in Hegel. This is a huge topic, and I just briefly want to touch upon this, but it's important that this is not an ontological split of here we have mechanics and there we have spiritual communication. It's more like a slippery slope, so to speak. And this is where I think Hegel's notion of second nature is to be placed. Let me now continue my typology of differences by coming to the last dimension, which is the Grunt. I think when it's true that Hegel's theory of, or Hegel's ontology can be understood as a general or universal theory of communication, I'm indebted here to Teunissen's work in Sein und Schein. If that is true, that we shall not understand Grunt as what is paradigmatically expressed in Leibniz's idea of the sufficient reason. So we have to come up with a non-classical understanding of Grunt. And classical one is the idea of the reason as a given, primordial to the unfolding a positivity. Yeah, this is the classical understanding of the sufficient reason. And Hegel is explicitly rejecting this. And I'm saying, and I have a very brief quote here, in determining itself as ground, essence determines itself as the non-determined. And only the sublating of its being determined is its determining. So the very idea of the reciprocity of identity difference doesn't have any space for understanding the reason as a given. Because only in negating its determinations, something is essentially what it is becoming. So transformation through communicative reciprocity is the actual ground of everything that there is. And Hegel spells out this by going into the debates on the ontological consequences that this has. Because if we follow Hegel, then it's clear that God is also negativity. It's not a given. It's not a positive being somewhere there in the sphere of the unchanging idea, but it's negative. It's a negativity. Hegel's theology, thus, is not negative theology because he holds on the principle of affability. So we can speak out the nature of God. This is different from negative theology. But God's different affability requires to apply the idea of reciprocal affection also to the what Levinas calls the complete other. So to the mundane. So there is no complete other to the mundane, but there is also the idea of reciprocal affection, which is to say that the no other is not complete other. Yeah, the difference, the ontological difference, is a big topic in Hegel, but it's definitely clear if you have a look on his lectures on religion that he has a place for this idea of negative parousia. So the idea of the dependence of the absolute from the subjective, from the finite. But this is just an implication, and now I'd like to move on and go back to the other side of the coin, so to speak, which is to say the subjective reflection. And this brings us back to the objections, because I like to have a look back on this massive material that Hegel is dealing with, and I'm trying to reconstruct here. So we'd have a look back. I started with some interpretive objections. The interpretive objections to dialetheism in Hegel, they claim that contradictions would be resolved in the course of thinking them through. To my knowledge, but I'm happy to be corrected, to my knowledge, no such a standard interpretation could recognize the relevance of the reciprocal affection idea in Hegel. So, and plus, no one of them can make place for Hegel's explicit rejection of both LNC and its negative reformulation. And the negative reformulation of LNC is Leibniz's law of identity. The principle of identity or contradiction is when meant to express merely abstract identity, or A equals A, in opposition to difference as a truth, is not a law of thought, but expressed rather the opposite of it. Yeah, so this is clear to me that interpretive objections lack in textual evidence. But what that means systematically, and I think we have to now understand that the claim for inferentiality and criticism as a very core features of method or conceptual method, then has to we have to understand this rejection of LNC, and altogether with LNC falls the abstract law of identity. We have to gain space for, or we have to account for inferentiality and critical normativity of the concept. So we could also ask this question by asking for the epistemological status of subjective reflection. Or in other words, what is a non-propositional but conceptual notion of Widerspruch? Yeah, like I said, conceptualism in Hegel means that the things as such are conceptually. So as everything in itself is contradictory, what then is the difference to propositional Widerspruch? This brings us now to the doctrine of the concept. And the doctrine of concepts is divided in three parts. First one is the analytic of the concept. This is where he comes up with the difference between singularity, particularity, and universality. And I'm gonna be rather briefly in saying this is to say that I think it's helpful to understand these as intentional contexts of the concept. So it's a difference if I speak of this item as a singular or as a particular or as a universal, but it's not that this item as such is a singular. Yeah, it is a different way of grasping the world. It's a different way of how the concept is in relation to its other, the extension. So the idea of intentionality is helpful, but it needs to be differentiated from the classical Fregean understanding of conceptual determinateness. Then I follow Brandon in here to say that the idea of complete sharp boundaries is not what Hegel has in mind. For Frege, in comparison, each concept must be determined in the sense that it must be semantically settled for every object, definitively, and in advance of applying the concept epistemically. So this is the idea in Frege, and so intention is kind of a flaw of the subjective reasoning. I think this is not what Hegel has in mind. So Hegel holds that conceptual determinateness cannot be settled before the application. The application of a concept is what transforms the conceptual boundaries. So it's a different understanding of intention, but still I think it's helpful to use these terms for reconstructing what happens in the doctrine of the concept. They are different because SPU, singular, particular, and universal, they have built-in tension because they have different assumptions. And the singular is related to the analytical. So the assumption here is that the totality is constituted by things with properties and propositions. So things are what they are in themselves, regardless of how we perceive of them. But this assumption is wrong. It's transzendentaler Schein, so to speak. Everything is through reciprocal communication. But this is the assumption that singularity is making. This is different to the particular. The particular holds that everything is in relation, and we will see in a minute that this relation comes in the three-folded manner, so to speak, because we have categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive relations. But this is what constitutes a totality, but this is what Hegel often calls the reflection in themselves. So this relatedness of everything to its other. This is also wrong, but I take this to be rather one-sided because we might discuss this as in regard to the question of if this list of categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive relationships, if that is exhaustive or not. So the last one, the universal, is the idea of the restored immediateness. So we have to understand the relatedness as part of the identity of everything that there is, which is to say that there is an interplay of subjective and objective reflection. And this is heavily prepositional because we have to come up with an idealistic ontology. And this is what the objectivity chapter is delivering from my point of view. But this is the framework, which I now will try to concretize a bit by coming now to the second step, the synthetics or the synthetic of the concept. This is the Hegelian version of the table of judgments, because the concept as such can be understood as the subjectivity of the concept, der Begriff als Begriff. So this is the difference I just briefly spelled out of the three intentions. But now we see that these intentions, they reappear in the reconstructing of the relation of the Begriff as such to its other, to the extension. And this relation has a certain form, and the form for this is the conceptual form of the predication, S is P. So this predication also has a certain typology, and this typology is the content of Hegel's tables of judgment. I'm gonna be very briefly. This is way too much. This could be an entire lecture on its own. I just want to touch upon some important features. The standard form, S is P, is a positive judgment. This is rather easy, I think. We've got a negative version of this, S is non-P, and then something extremely interesting happens. He comes up with what he calls the infinite judgment. What that is, the infinite judgment. Plus, it comes in two versions, negative and positive. And I think it's very helpful to think of the positive infinite judgment as what is also known as tautologies. According to Hegel, a tautology must be untrue, because if A and non-A do not come up with any content, they cannot constitute formal consistency. So this is very different to standard logics, where in standard logics, tautologies are defined as what is necessarily true, because by virtue of their form. For Hegel, this is nonsense. Nothing is true because of the very form. It has to have a certain content relation. So saying A is A or bachelors are bachelors whatsoever is nonsense, according to Hegel. Same holds for, or not the same, but something similar happens with the negative infinite judgment, which is what the tradition knows as category mistakes. And Hegel's example is compelling. Spirit is not red, yeah, or not archaic or whatsoever. So this is true, but it's not a judgment, because spirit cannot bear the proposition, it cannot bear the predicate of a color. So it's a true judgment in the sense of it's a true utterance, but it doesn't constitute a judgment because it's nonsense. So the predicate and the subject, they have to have, so to speak, they have to live, they have to inhibit the same logical space. If they are too close, and like in the sense that if they are identical, then the judgment is not a judgment, just a mere tautology. If they are too far remote and too far away from another, they don't constitute a unity. This is a category mistake. Let me just move on briefly and try to continue with the reconstruction of what Hegel calls the judgment of reflection. So if I have an S as P, then I can raise the question if all S are to be a P, or modally speaking, if it is necessary that S has P. There is a negative form to this. And this brings us now to the second sort, which is the particular judgment of reflection. So if I have an S which is P, and I have another S stroke, which is also P, that I might infer that there is something like a set of S types bearing P. And this is the very proto-structure, the very structure of the categorical judgment. But so the idea of the particular judgment presupposes a theory of what it is to be a judgment, what it is a judgment to be categorical. So we have to spell out this presupposition. How do we do so? We do not gain this universality invested here by induction. So if I have S, which is P, I cannot just continue in saying all the S's I have seen so far, they be appears, so it's necessary that P for S, because on empirical grounds, no universality, or I'd like to speak of normativity, is established. How do we get then at universality? Next step, through reflecting upon the necessity in the relation of S P. We've got three types: categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive ones. The categorical implication relation is that we have an S, which is P, because S being a species of the genus G, and we've got P qualifying the genus G. So therefore, S as P is necessarily the case. We've got a different relation. We've got these dynamical ones. So we've got cause and effect. So S of P implies S to be P stroke. And then we've got disjunctive ones. So we've got an S stroke and an S stroke, all being P. So we can infer, or we can think of these to be species of G and still P qualifying G. So what is now extremely interesting is his appropriation, Hegel's appropriation of the fourth and the last category. Kant and the tradition, they speak of modalities. Hegel calls this the conceptual dimension of the judgment. And here is something extremely happening, something extremely interesting happening. Whereas in Kant, the dimensions of the esoteric, problematic, and finally the apodictic is spelled out on epistemic grounds. So the security of my assertion is what is the ground for differentiating these types. Hegel spells this out on ontological or objectively. Yeah, this is also, he makes this explicit in saying it's not convincing to spell this out as just only based on epistemic grounds. Must have a ground in itself. In der Sache selbst muss ein Grund liegen. So the esoteric dimension of judgment is a question. I like to reconstruct this as a question, which is to say that the normativity of conceptual necessity is merely, which is to say, subjectively asserted. So why does S of P to be the case? Why is it necessary that P qualifies G substantially? Well, this is a question that the esoteric movement dimension makes us ask. So what is the answer to this question? The answer is something I find in Hegel quite systematically compelling. If everything is constituted through relation, so which is to say that all existence is substantially in relation, then everything that there is substantially contingent. Because everything is relational and reciprocally constituted. So change and transformation contingency is part of the ontological framework. This is what the problematic dimension of the judgment makes explicit. So, and the inference from this is extremely important. This is why I put it in bold letters here. If everything is substantially in relation to other, then everything, I quote, is fractured into its art and its being. The fracturation of art and being, is the absolute judgment on all actuality. So as contingency is substantial, the source of normativity is conceptual and not natural. So this is an explicit rejection of all sorts of naturalistic reading in Hegels. We find this often in, let's say, analytical reappropriations of Kant. So Pinkett, for example, has a book on Hegel's naturalism. The art-being distinction is one of the axioms of dialectics. And that's why I think naturalism is not, I think naturalism is rather a non-starter if it comes to the question of normativity in Hegel. So I'm running out of time, so I continue. So this is the last step I want to do in the doctrine of the concept, the subjectivity chapter. We have now to move on and go to the syllogism, der Schluss. So we've got Begriff as such, judgment, and now it's der Schluss, the inference, syllogism. But this is where he says that all things are syllogism. So this is the ontological conceptualism in Hegel, which is to say that everything that there is a universal, united through particularity with singularity. Surely it is not a whole made up of three propositions. So what is now, or what is the question is, what is inferential order? So what is the syllogistic form of everything that there is? And I think it's necessary to leave behind a certain paradigm, which is the idea of logical order or inferential order to be deductive order. For Hegel, the deduction is nothing else than a complex tautology, a very empty form. It doesn't help us in nothing. You have to leave it behind. So the form of the deduction is A implying B. We've got an A, so we can infer that B to be the case. The problem here is that the problem here is the idea of the monotony of deductive reasoning. So A implying B is a case invariant of its very context. This is wrong. So context dependency, the non-monotony of deductive reasoning, is to reject the idea of language of logics as a meta language, which is invariant to its context. Hegel rejects this idea when he comes to speak about Leibniz's conception of the logic as characteristica universalis. In Hegel, we find this as addressed as Schriftsprache. Giovanni translates this as standard language. Might be fair, might be not, because Schriftsprache has this written element in it. But for the sake of my argument, it doesn't matter, I think, to differentiate, because the idea is this of context invariant logics. And I think this is an undialectical understanding, because Hegel holds that if in a relational combination, which is essentially dialectical, a content does not retain the same determinations that it has when fixed in isolation. So isolation, relation, make it dialectical. Henceforth, we cannot speak of the monotony of reasoning. So this was my reconstruction here. So I think we have to leave behind the false idea of logic as a standard language, of Schriftsprache. So this is to say that the isomorphy of subject and object invites us to give up the idea of monotonic standard language. Yeah? Logic is not a canonical method of proving doxa, but an organon of knowledge, of episteme. So it's more often hermeneutics, so to speak, instead of canon of criticizing propositions. Which is to say that I don't find it so fair to speak of Hegel's logics as a Procrustean bed, because this is just a repetition of its own critique of the canonical understanding of logics. Logics is what enables us to see, so to speak, to see more and deeper to the ontological framework than what we have accessible through sensual intuition. So this is very helpful, what I find in the literature by Förster, the 25 years of philosophy, where he reconstructs the pace from Kant to Hegel through this idea of intellectual intuition. So logics is intellectual intuition. We see more and deeper, and this is a different understanding of logics than expressed in standard logics. Okay, I'm close to the end, but I still have to come to the table of inferences. And I'm gonna be very briefly on here. So the idea of a non-monotonic inferential practices, this is what he is coming up with in his table of inferences. The deduction is kind of left behind as the syllogism of allness, but it is, as it says, this is just the allness of all singulars. So this is to say that is some sort of an immediacy. It does not obtain the allness, the Allheit here is not concrete enough. It's just the allness of singulars. So how do we get at allness or universality? I think it's helpful to understand his notion of induction to be close to what Peirce knows as abduction, so the inference to a species. The problem here is that we have to look for counterexamples. So if there is an S which is of part of G, but is different from other S's, so we have to look for counterexamples. I think Hegel annihilates the very idea of analogy. So S is P, S is analog to S stroke, henceforth S stroke is to be P. The problem here is the existence of homonyms. So the moon, this is the example that he has there. The moon as a planet the Earth as a planet has inhabitants. The moon as a planet, henceforth the moon has inhabitants. This is wrong, but the problem here is that we have the idea of as a planet to be homonymic in these contexts. So we have to look out for, so we have to be critical in our reasoning. But the inferences then we find in the next table are categorical, they are hypothetical, so they qualify S as G substantially, they spell out the idea in hypothetical cases that from S, P, we can infer to S, P stroke to be the case because of dynamical relationships of cause and effects, also chemical relations, but also sufficient and necessary conditions, right? All these kinds of hypothetical relationships are grasped or are reconstructed in this second table here, and we've got the disjunctive reasoning, which is actually way more interesting than Hegel thought of this to be. In Hegel's point of view, this is rather trivial, but it allows us to see that he has an idea of natural kinds as being stable sorts. This is a problematic aspect of his theory. I will briefly come back to this later on my last chapter, on my last slide. But I would like to be very quick on the non-existence of the fourth category, the modality. The modality does not exist. There is no modality of the inference. We have a modality of the judgment, but there is no inference of the concept as such. So how do we deal with this? And my proposal is right here, which is to say that we have to read the objectivity chapter as the modality of the concept. So objectivity is the modality of the concept, and this is what we have here. So I align I do align the modality of mechanical processes to the assertive modality, which is to say that the cause asserts itself in its effect, but the effect has no say on it. This is to say that we have asymmetrical communications. That's why they are abstract. And they are kind of related to the sphere of understanding and the analytical capacities. We've got the chemical modalities, which is the rational combination, which is isomorphic to the problematic modality, the dissolution of oppositions, so that nothing is fixed, but everything is in constant change through this relation. This is paradigmatically expressed in chemical relations. But the idea is that the parts, they do not maintain themselves. They just transformed. Yeah. So this is sort of an irreversible reciprocity, and that's why it remains abstract in comparison to the third one. And this chemical, so to speak, the synthetic capacity is aligned with reason. Last but not least, the modality of the teleological relation, parts and whole or purpose. This is close to the apodictic modality of subjective rational combination. The idea here seems to me that in teleological communication, the purpose requires the sustainability of the means, which is to say that the means gains higher actuality in its purpose, but it is also to be maintained or to remain itself. This is close to the capacity of dialectical capacity thinking or spirit. This is my very last chapter, my last slide, because here we see why Hegel is kind of indebted to Kant, where he says that the very idea of the inner purpose, the innere Zweckmäßigkeit, is what the critique of the third critique has opened up to, but not spelled out. Positively, we don't know what the inner purpose is, but I think this is kind of Kant's contribution to philosophy from Hegel's point of view, that the opposition of teleology and mechanism is the opposition of freedom and necessity. And this is what Hegel sees in Kant as being his major contribution. But I think this is a problem. Yeah. So I leave my presentation with an open question, which is, how do we make sense of Hegel's affirmation of teleology as the highest form of objective sort of relation, without just rejecting this as pre-modern? Because, like I said earlier on, Hegel is rejecting the idea of the sufficient reason as a given positivity. I quote again, essence determines itself only, or it determines itself as a non-determined. So there is no idea of an intelligent designer designing the inner purposiveness of the world. This is what Hegel says explicitly. So in order to bring this his own account to an end, I think we have to kind of liquefy or pluralize, or give it a pluralistic shape of his account of nature. Because I don't think it is right to oppose freedom as necessity, in the sense of we've got freedom reserved for the spiritual side, the subjective side, and necessity, law-likeness, as necessity to the objective side. It must be a more dialectical understanding. And I think it's helpful to question Hegel's pre-Darwinian understanding of natural kinds. But this would be a way of thinking with Hegel, against Hegel. And this is my very last remark. I kind of did so to speak, in the chapter on Hegel's Logics in my book on Die Pluralität des Absoluten. So this is my dissertation. So this is forthcoming next year. And this is where I then go on and continue to criticize Hegel's natural philosophy based on this idea of immanent critique that I have been presenting here with all of you. And this is my last work. I really do thank you. I'm running out of time. I'm sorry for this, and I appreciate all feedback and especially critique. And now I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Shall I take down the slides, or how do we do? Yes?
Yes. Graham, you're on mute.
Shall I chair this, Greg?
Yeah, would you mind moderating?
Sure. Okay. Well, okay, so we're open for questions and discussion. Okay, Stefan, you're up first.
Okay, thanks you for your talk. You wanted an example for somebody who has a standard interpretation and uses this idea of Wechselwirkung. I would say that Dieter Wattschneider would be someone who tries this. So he speaks of negative feedback and interprets the antinomies of Hegel as negative feedback, which somehow is even better, I think, than Wechselwirkung. And he thinks that each contradiction in the logic has to be solved. And I don't agree with this interpretation. I think it's not the best interpretation, but at least he would be an example who you should look into. Then I don't believe that Hegel really thinks that tautologies are nonsense. I mean, he gives a very interesting interpretation to tautologies in his discussion of identity, when he says, look, if somebody utters a tautology like God is, then we think, oh no, there comes something different from God. And then we are disappointed because the person says, oh, God is God. But on a deeper level, he says, oh yes, this is somehow can be understood in a speculative manner, namely that difference comes up when somebody says God is, and then this difference gets negated or is negated. And this is exactly what identity is, namely the difference from difference, or the negation of negation. So I don't think that he really thinks that tautology in itself is nonsense. I think he gives a pretty smart explanation of it. What I don't see is, or what I really have issues with, is your interpretation of the third critique. First, it doesn't come as a surprise that somebody says, oh yes, the third critique is highly relevant for the post-Kantian thinkers. Everybody referred to the third critique, but it was and when they say that Kant has become an old idiot, it's not the third critique, it's his metaphysics of morals, where they think he has gone a little bit crazy. But usually they refer to his concept of intuitive understanding, which you didn't refer to, I think, in your talk. And the reflections, on the other hand, you didn't. So it wouldn't be the notion of, or the notions of reflection, which he explicates in his first critique, where he has this amphiboly of the notions of reflection. There we have identity, we have difference, we have matter, and so on. So this seems to be closer to the determinations of reflection than his idea of reflection in the third critique. And the last one is not very important, but you shouldn't say that Plato's ideas are unchanging, especially if we refer to Hegel, because he takes this, or where we can find this idea of ideas as changing, is the Sophistes, which he was one of the first ones to rediscover and see, oh, this is really a speculative text of Aristotle, of Plato, because there the idea of movement, the other ideas partake in the idea of movement, identity, difference, being, and rest. And he has the symploke eidon, so the interrelation of the ideas. I think that Hegel was highly influenced by this idea of ideas which he can find in Plato. And this seems more like a caricature of Plato's ideas, to say, oh yes, there are these ideas, and they are in a heaven and they are always the same. I would be kind of careful with critiques like this. But thank you for your talk. It was really great.
Great. Now you put so much stuff on the table that I'm thankful for your reference to Dieter Wannschneider. I haven't read this in depth, so I can't really tell. If it is helpful to understand negative feedback as a substantial contribution to identity, then I'm on board. Then I have a counterexample to my suggestion, so I will have a look on this. Thank you for this. So the second topic you raised is the treatment of tautologies. I mean, I haven't been explicitly saying this, but the apodictic judgment, the judgment of all actuality, is also infinite. So the true form of an infinite judgment is that the subject and the predicate is identical. So in this sense, it is also tautology that we have in the apodictic judgment, because it's true of every item to say that art and being is differentiated, but we can also use this predication of all items that there are. So that is sort of a judgment from a speculative point of view, but the idea of nonsense for the non-speculative forms of judgment, tautologies, the non-speculative tautologies, this is nonsense. This is a quotation. I mean, he himself calls this nonsense. And I think it's helpful because this might be spelled out as something as the pragmatics of Hegel's Science of Logics, because he has a difference between, or he makes a difference between an utterance, an Satz, and an Urteil, which is not, because the context is important. It can be that's a saying, mein Freund N ist gestorben, my friend N has died. Could be a judgment, or it could be just a mere Satz. And this is dependent on the context. And I think if you want a tautology to be nonsense, to be senseful, to be a judgment, you have to come up with a context within which it is helpful to say of God to be God. You know, like, what is God like, or something like this, or what is a bachelor? If you find a context within which this is a true judgment, then you have a counterexample against Hegel's analysis. But as long as saying God is not judgment because it's not controversial, it is senseless. And I think this is Hegel's account on non-speculative tautologies, because it's the idea of the empty form. And just to the last two points on Kant and also on Plato, I think this is a general objection, or the general observation that I make, that Hegel is always trying to be fair to his predecessors. So when he reads Kant, when he reads Aristotle, when he reads Plato, he strengthens them by reading them speculatively. So you can always make them more convincing on Hegelian grounds by showing the speculative character that there is. And nothing is black and white. We have these tendencies in Kant, we have them in Plato, and it's also completely true, I'm all on your side, that he is heavily influenced by Plato. I mean, I did not touch upon what comes after the objectivity chapter in the last part of the subjective logics, because here we have this identity of the good and the truth, and this is mere Platonism. So the idea of dialectics is kind of, I mean, he makes this explicit, comes from Plato, but it needs to be differently spelled out or actualized, and there kind of also is critical towards the ontology of Plato. So, but again, it's a way of strengthening Plato to read him on speculative lines, and I think this is what Hegel invites us to do. Yeah, this would be my short answer to this. It's just to the third point about Kant. Yeah, exemplary validity, exemplarische Gültigkeit. This is what we have to find, and this capacity is what is of interest for Hegel and Kant. So this is the systematic answer why the third critique plays such a big role to Hegel's reconstruction of the Kantian tradition.
Stefan, do you want to come back on this?
Yes. Only on one question, if I may. So your answer, that find a context where it makes sense, sounds more like Wittgenstein's uncertainty. So this is my hand, but Hegel is not Wittgenstein. So I wouldn't think that you should it's not trivial, and I think that Hegel knows it. There are large discussions or big discussions whether a sentence like Pegasus est Pegasus is really true because it's a tautology, or whether it's not true. There are a lot of thinkers who would say, no, it's not true. For example, Ockham was one of the guys who would say, no, it's not true because there are, in fact, no Pegasoi. So the proposition Pegasus est Pegasus is not true. So I think also for Hegel, both the proposition as a judgment and as a sentence of God is God or Pegasus est Pegasus is much more interesting than it seems to you. And I think it's not the same as in Wittgenstein's uncertainty, find a context. But this is only my opinion. You can, of course, have another opinion.
Yeah, but I agree with your observation. My Hegel is rather close to Wittgenstein. And yeah, but this would be another topic, another lecture. Yeah, but thanks. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for your talk. I think there are many aspects that I genuinely share about your interpretation of Hegel, and especially the stress you give to the idea of the innere Zweckmäßigkeit, which is a very crucial concept or a very crucial aspect that should be considered when one tries to spell out what dialectics is. What dialectics is, and what is the interplay between logic and metaphysics that we have in Hegel's dialectics. What I wanted to ask is related to the relationship between dialectics and formal logic, because in a way you stress the idea of method, and then you stress the fact that content is absolutely crucial in order or the relation to the content is absolutely crucial in order to understand what the dialectical method is. So the method is the universal character of the content or the content's form. So you stress the idea of method, and you stress less the idea of form. And then you also say that Hegel criticized Leibniz's idea of characteristica universalis, because what you think it's wrong, what Hegel, or what you say that Hegel didn't like was the invariant aspect, or the absence of a context sensitivity in the idea of a characteristica universalis. But then you also say that Hegel's logic, or we can say that Hegel has a kind of non-monotonic view of logic in mind, so non-monotonic reasoning, and then also context sensitivity. And so, perhaps you could say more about what kind of logic is Hegel's logic according to you. Is it a formal logic, or isn't it a formal logic? And in what sense it's right for you to say that Hegel was a dialetheist, and in what sense it's wrong? Mm-hmm. If it is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. This is kind of related to Stefan's question on what we started talking about, the status of tautology and form in Hegel's logics. And well, I'm extremely unsure how to answer this. When Hegel speaks of method, he does not have something as calculus in mind. So he is extremely critical of the idea of of the idea of 2025 different sorts of calculuses. So if logical reasoning would just be an algorithm, so it's not that we have a certain input, then we've got an algorithm and something comes out of this. So this is the idea of, this is Verstandes form of reasoning. So his understanding of logical reasoning is in this sense is not formal, but it's not that easy, because his informal way of logic is not a methodological. So there is method without form, so to speak, or we shall not identify formality of reasoning with its methodological character. There is something like a content sort of method, and this is what he is aiming at. So the truth of a sentence must be if it is spelling out the tension of the matter in hand. So in this sense, form is neither sufficient nor necessary for inferences to be truth. They must spell out the very dialectics of the matter in hand. So the best example that I know is the dialectics of freedom, which is then the dialectics of dominant submission. So the very idea of lordship and bondship. This is what it does in the phenomenology. This is the very tension of what it is to be a free human being, struggling with others and have all these interrelations that we have with others. So the very idea is not that, as in Kant, the reason and the senses are opposed. It's rather that we have this dialectics kind of internalized. Being free means to also be restrained. Yeah, so this is the true contradiction, so to speak. And this is what we have to come up with. And logics, from my point of view, is something as in heuristics, in order to reach these contradictions, these inner tensions of the object of thought. So in that sense is method, but not formal. So my hesitation to say that Hegel's logic is informal comes now from what might be something like a non-classical understanding of formalism in logics. So there might be something like, say, formalisms, which are like quantum mechanical sorts of formalisms, right? If you have not fuzzy logic, but beyond that, if you have a calculus which is able to calculate with A and non-A to be the case, then we might have a way of coming up with a formal way of reconstructing Hegel's method. But Hegel himself could not see this because, quantum mechanics is 100 years later. So quantum computing might be a way of coming up with formalities for these kinds of dialectical reasoning. But this is definitely not my cup of tea. This is ways beyond my knowledge. So all I want to say is that we shall not identify method with form, but be open for a different understanding of method, and maybe we gain grounds for understanding formalities in a non-algorithmic way of understanding forms. It might be that context dependency, the openness to different, to understand that there is a pragmatics built in to the idea of logics. So we might have this as formalized, but this is something I can't deliver. It's just that, this is very important. And this is also kind of an answer to this question on what sort of dialetheism I see in Hegel. So it's not that, a contradictory proposition as such is not sufficient for this proposition to be true. So A and non-A as such does not suffice for the truth of this double proposition, but it's necessary. This is what I think it's true. Whenever you have to come up with the metaphysics of an object, be it freedom, you have to have these dialectical tensions as the matter at the gain of your explication. If you have a non-dialectical explication of freedom, you don't have any explanation of freedom at all. But it's not sufficient because it must be kind of justified by the material by the object of thought. And this is the idea. So dialetheism means that the dialectical form of the proposition is necessary but not sufficient. In this sense, it's true to think of some contradictions to be truth, but not all of them, because they are wrong contradictions. So sensibility and reasonability as a contradiction, as it is in Kant, is a wrong contradiction in the sense of compared to the dialectics of recognition that we have in the phenomenology of spirit. So this is kind of what I mean. Yeah. I see you nodding, so.
Yeah, no, very useful, thanks. May I ask another small question, Graham?
Of course, yeah.
I just wanted to know more about Teunissen's idea of theory of communication. You used the English expression theory of communication. Is it in German Kommunikation? Is it Kommunikation? So like Habermas. Is there some sort of connection to Habermas? Or?
Well, this is a huge question. I love this question. It's in Habermas, I think there is a certain node to metaphysics, and Teunissen does deal with the idea of metaphysics as being a critical endeavor all the way through. So the first metaphysics is critical metaphysics. So the very idea of metaphysics, and then we've got the moderns to be critical of metaphysics. No, so metaphysics is critical on its own, on its own project from the very beginning, and this is what he tries to see in Hegel and Hegel's approach of the ancients. So in this sense, it's a different conception of the history of philosophy. And then Teunissen has also a big problem because he kind of has this opposition of Exposition or Darstellung, reconstruction. So this is how he takes Hegel's first books of the Logics to be, this is what he takes these parts to be doing, just reconstructing what there is. And then there comes the last part, the subjective logics. And I think this is kind of wrong because Hegel's method is immanent critique. So when he reconstructs, he appropriates the canon, he appropriates the tradition. And this is what it means to be scientifically working on metaphysical questions, right? The very idea of reconstruction is appropriation. And so the difference between the mere reconstruction and then its own systematic approach, which I see guiding Teunissen in its approach to the science of logic, is rather misleading, but still it is very helpful because he goes into close reading on very helpful passages, and where he goes to very more detailed, as I have been able to deliver, into the idea of reciprocity. So he comes with this way from the objective logics to the doctrine of reflection. I just skipped this over. So in this sense, it's a very helpful book. But the idea of communication comes from Teunissen. Yeah, allgemeine Kommunikationstheorie, general theory of communication, and this then has implications have ethical implications. If everything is constituted through communication, what then is the special form of communication that is our privilege, so to speak? Yeah, and so this is the ethical implication, and this brings then Teunissen to speak on also the ontological implications, and this is extremely helpful because these the idea of the dependency of the absolute, although represented as God, from the subjective, from the finite, in Hegel's understanding of the parish, the community. So, shall recognition be among us? This is how we kind of constitute the absolute. So it has direct ethical implications, and this is like the special theory of communication, the spiritual one. But also he is critical of Hegel because he does not believe that Hegel really would reach at the restored immediacy. So in this sense, I'm more pro-Hegelian than Teunissen is, because I do think that we kind of that he manages to deliver his promise of the restored immediacy.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Toby. You discussed the whole of the logic, so I have a lot of questions, and I have maybe too many to ask you today, but I will ask a couple that I think will get to the core of the matter for me. Yeah, so I appreciated a lot of the reconstruction you did. I like the questions that you began with, and I think I agree generally with a lot of the points that you raised. I am interested in the way in which just generally your background in critical theory and your approach to Hegel through critical theory changes the way you read Hegel. So just generally, I'm thinking about that as I ask these questions, and I think this may be a point of difference between us. So I'm interested to kind of tease those out because I see a lot of similarities. So just with that said, my first question is about these three forms of syllogism that we see in the logic. We have syllogism, to put it differently, of the abstract universal, syllogisms of sets, syllogisms of genus and species. But like you said, we don't have this fourth kind. We don't have the syllogism of the concept or this. And you want to find the fourth in objectivity. And I found that in need of justification. So I would just want to ask you why you should look for a fourth when the absence of the fourth just shows that you shouldn't understand, here's one way of doing it, the concept in terms of syllogism. That actually, once you've arrived at Begriff proper, you transcend something like inference and syllogism altogether. So that's my question. Why do you have to go to, I mean, the transition to objectivity is transcending syllogism. It's canceling it. It does preserve it, right? Mechanism is described in terms of syllogisms, right? And with the alternating middle terms, but it's not just syllogism. It's canceled and preserved. So syllogism has been canceled as such and preserved. And so looking for the fourth in objectivity is a bit strange because, well, syllogism has been canceled and preserved as something different now. So I'm just curious why you would look for the fourth in objectivity. It's, I understand kind of the nice if we were Kantian and we needed everything in fours, okay. But, we don't have that neurosis so much in Hegel, right? Okay, so that's my first question. And maybe you have good reason for it. I'm just curious because it is kind of a perplexing absence. Yep. In a way, right? And my second question has to do with Wechselwirkung, and I'm hoping you can just generally say more about it. But what I wanted to ask you was whether the concept of self-particularization really isn't more fundamental than Wechselwirkung. And this is why. So you didn't talk about self-particularization very much in your reconstruction, but Hegel describes the concept, der Begriff, before introducing Urteil, before discussing Urteil. He talks about the concept as a kind of self-particularizing power, that the concept is the agency. The concept itself is the subjectivity. So in logic, we don't have people, we don't have persons communicating. We have the concept, which is the agency that particularizes itself. And that's why when you get to, objectivity, you get the ontological argument, right? The concept has particularized itself, right? Made itself objective. And that's another way of reading teleology, right? Teleology as another form of self-particularization, right? The end, that is its own means, right? As in a living organism, the end that realizes itself, right? So what I'm wondering is, like in Hegel, we have this idea of concept of self-particularization, which then you can find expressed in the ontological argument. You can find further expressed in the idea of an internal teleology in the sense of, say, Aristotle, not in the sense of a designer God. And so you have this self-particularization that seems to be fundamental to the whole of the subjective logic. And in particular, the way this shows up logically, of course, is that the order of terms is reversed as the way you described it. You talk about the singular as the analytical, the particular as the synthetic, and universal as dialectical. Now that does seem to like follow the order in judgment, right? I mean, at least certain forms, but in the logic of the concept, right? It's, can you still hear me? My internet connection.
Yeah, I do. I'm fine. Yeah.
Did I break up?
No.
Okay, good. Sorry. Universal comes first, then particular, then singular. right? So the concept is conceptual. And so he says the concept is a concept. The concept is a particular. And it's a particular virtue of this self-referential predication. And then as a result, we have singularity, which is this unity of universal and particular. So before you get to judgment, in just Begriff, right, you have Allgemeinheit, Besonderheit, Einzelheit. And Einzelheit is the Einheit, right, of Allgemeinheit und Besonderheit. And what's interesting is that the singularity comes to be in virtue of the universal all by itself. Quite fascinating. The universal is somehow self-singularizing. And singularity there is a kind of totality of the other determinations. So what I'm wondering is, you have this very strange, again, self-particularizing feature that seems to be engendered by self-referential predication. And whatever Wechselwirkung that you have between, say, multiple determinations seems to somehow be a kind of posterior to this more fundamental form. So I'm just curious what you understand by Wechselwirkung exactly, why you give it such an essential place, and what do you do with this weird, what seems to be weird for a lot of us? I mean, for me, it's kind of normal now after spending too much time with Hegel, but what do you do with self-particularization?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a very long question.
I'm very thankful, very grateful for this question. Let me start with the first one. Why did I set out and reconstructed objectivity as the fourth sort of the inference? Basically, because I want to come up with a theory that makes place or gains space for the textual evidence that I found in the book. Because for Hegel, from my point of view, is a conceptualist. It's the concepts is not just, they don't have a subjective origin. They constitute the matter as such. So the objectivity behaves objectively, so to speak, because it's conceptual. So this is anti-Kantian. And I think falls short in seeing the radicality of Hegel's method if we don't come up with a friendly reading of this, because it's very easy to reject. Yeah, but how to spell it out? And I think it's helpful. What I find helpful is that we have the tripartite structure of mechanical, chemical, and also theological rational combinations as the idea of modalities. So I find this helpful because chemistry is pretty much based on the idea of syntheses, the dissolution of oppositions, the relational character. I think this is kind of helpful to think of this as an ontological feature of the things in themselves. So they behave in this sense synthetically. So therefore, the synthesis is, as a function of the subjective spirit, is justified in doing what they are doing. Same with the idea of analyzing things and abstracting from this kind of relational character and seeing things as kind of merely in interaction on mechanical grounds. So I think this is also objective justification for this very function that we find in our mental capacities. And last but not least, to align theology with speculation, but bearing in mind that his note to sufficient reason is extremely interesting, because this is what I think helpful to, I mean, this is a place where I place my own criticism in Hegel, because I don't think it's a good idea to think of natural kinds as being stable. Yeah. So the idea of how to bring in Darwin into his conception of life, this is place, because if we think of the inner purpose as what I propose in my PhD project as plurality of forms of life, then we have to give up the very idea of natural sorts. And I think this is what happens like kind of 20 years later, Hegel's death, right? I mean, this is kind of the same time. So we have to shift our perspective and don't ask, how can it be that some individuals do not meet the conditions of their species, but species is constantly changing. So we kind of shift our perspectives. And I think Hegel's ontology or process ontology is an invitation to do so, even though it does not go this final step, so to speak. So I think this is where I would place the immanent critique of Hegel's natural philosophy, because natural philosophy and logics are not separated. They are the same. This is the implication of conceptualism. So I don't think that we have to leap, so to speak, after we reach the absolute idea now to real philosophy and kind of ask, okay, how can it be that these logical categories, they are applicable or not? It's the same project. If we reconstruct his logics, we have to reconstruct his natural philosophy, and his natural philosophy is procedural, so there is movement, but it's not Darwinian, and this is kind of an invitation to do this. But I think this becomes kind of a demand if I am going on these lines and saying, well, I'm compelled by thinking of objectivity as the modalities of the concept, so conceptual idealism. So but it's also true, and this is why I stressed so much the idea of asymmetries. It's not the same. The subjective forms of relating are not the same as the objective forms, because there is no being for itself. So it's true that in comparison to communication, mechanical communication is abstract because the effect has no say on its own course. In this sense, it's just asymmetrical, but the idea here is also to spell out the difference. So the same respect that allows us to identify subject and object must be the respect under which we spell out the difference. Otherwise, it's not compelling. This is from a methodological point of view necessary. So the same Hinsicht, the same respect must be able to do both. And I think this is helpful with these modalities. And also the implication of this is that we, the spiritual communicative beings that we are, we can transgress and be mechanically interacting in a mechanical way. And this is how I see that the ethical implications or the implications for a critical theory of society, how they would gain power out of the logics, because the very idea of second nature has this kind of slippery aspect. So it's not that we once reached a level of communicative practices being spiritual and reflexive and based on recognition and everything is fine. It's more that we can regress into mechanical forms. So the idea of abstract law is mechanically, or we can the idea of domestication, right? In the sense of I learn how to repeat canonical texts. I just repeat, but I don't have gained knowledge of these poets, what they really mean. I just have them by out of my hand. So it can be mechanical also in the sense of that my own subjective capacities are exerted in a mechanical way. And this is a regression. So the idea of aligning, or not aligning, but the idea of what is regression in Hegel is can learn a lot from his ontology, his idealistic ontology. And this is why I think it's helpful to go into these debates or these questions also from social theoretical point of view, or critical theoretical point of view, or Frankfurt School sort of point of view, because in Frankfurt School, they too often are following the Habermasian thinking, saying that metaphysics are bad, so we need to overcome metaphysics, so we don't read the absolute, the doctrine of the absolute, just the Grundlinien, just the objective spirit. And I think this is wrong. You have to understand what Hegel's ontology can teach us in regard to vivid understanding. And just a very kind of detour. You know, someone as Honneth is an elitist. Yeah, for Honneth, it's clear that the very idea of pathologies, what Honneth calls social pathologies, has a logical form, which is contradictions, the contradictions of labor and property. And then as long as we haven't overcome these contradictions, we are still in a pre-revolutionary sort of state. And I think this is not valid on Hegelian terms, because the very problem of social pathologies, of modern pathologies, according to Hegel, is indifference, the existence of oppositions without their communication. This is the very core of modern pathologies. And so it has direct implications for a critical theory if you think through the science of logics. And I see you raising your hand, but I just want to briefly say something on this. I just want to express my thankfulness, because I haven't seen it that way, that Wechselwirkung and the idea of self-particularization are in tension. And it's true. I kind of tend to downplay self-particularization and highlight communication. because I think for me, it's kind of a logical point of view. In order to be self-particularizing, I need the relation to my other. I cannot just self-particularize myself without its relation to the other. So it's kind of reciprocity, Wechselwirkung must be a precondition for self-particularization, but vice versa. If I understand myself differently or self-particularize, then I might interact differently in this reciprocal dimension that I have with others. But this is very subjectively speaking now, but it's a very interesting thought to kind of pose or question, yeah.
Could I respond briefly? Is it okay?
Sure.
Yeah, so thanks for the answers. So yeah, this book that I wrote on Hegel, not to plug myself shamelessly, really develops this idea of self-particularization. So you may find it interesting. I don't discuss Wechselwirkung at all, so it's something I'll have to think about in connection to this, and maybe for your own thinking too, to think about to what extent your account can accommodate this idea in Hegel, and to what extent is it in tension with it. So just something to think about as you go on. I just a few comments about what you said. I really agree Hegel is a conceptualist. And for me, he's a conceptualist in the strongest sense one can be one. So, I mean, I hold that for Hegel, there's nothing exists except the concept. Mm. So my view is that actually whatever there is constituted material and formally in a conceptual way. And there's a long story about why that's the case. So I agree with this point. But I wonder whether you need to have this fourth form of inference or syllogism in order to hold that view. You could just hold the view that Hegel is a conceptualist, thoroughly a conceptualist. The concept is sufficient for its own truth. Nothing is except the concept, materially and formally. But say that ultimately the concept, what it is, cannot sufficiently be articulated in syllogistic forms, at least understood in a particular way. I'll just put that aside for now, just something to think about. There's, I guess, different ways of thinking of Hegel as a conceptualist. And I'm also wondering why, Schelling's philosophy of nature may also be very interesting here, because you may think Schelling's philosophy of nature would offer you more flexibility than Hegel's. I don't know, I just put it out there as a possibility. Because of course, Schelling would complain that Hegel basically took it from him, more or less, anyway. Anyway, I'll put that aside, but that may be an interesting, the stuff in the 1790s that Schelling's doing. I don't know if it helps Hegel at all, or if it responds to this problem, because it's still pre-Darwinian, as you said. And I think that is a big problem. The Hegel and evolution is something that certainly has to be dealt with. Finally, I wanted to say something about logic and nature, because, early on you said that the absolute can't be opposed to the empirical. And of course, you're right at a certain level. I mean, absolute spirit, for example, it's only absolute if it's somehow all-encompassing. But I wonder whether you think logic itself is natural, and logic qua logic, because one could argue that logic itself, the concept of being, the concept of nothing, the concept of becoming per se, aren't themselves empirical determinations. Even if they are somehow, even if they can have natural instantiations and spiritual instantiations. So it seems like there's a difference between logic qua nature, logic qua spirit. And one could say everything is logic, but qualified, logic qua nature, logic qua spirit. And then in the religious allegorical discussions of this, you could talk about Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? Or however you want to do it. So I wonder whether there isn't a confusion that when we say, logic can't be opposed to nature. Well, that's right, but it also should be, because logic is, Hegel's not going to commit the fallacy of psychologism or things like that, So I don't know what your thoughts would be on that, but
yeah, thank you.
Whether you're just mixing up logic with everything, and then like the study of nature, the study of logic, the study of spirit, study of logic, or is it that there is a study of logic qua logic, and then logic qua nature, and logic qua spirit, and these are different, but they're all logic in some way. I don't know if that's kind of where you are, or if you have a different idea. So thanks a lot.
Thanks to you. I do have sort of a different idea, actually, I must say. But how could I start? It's from, like I said in the very beginning, that I did my PhD on Hegel's Doctrine of the Absolute. So I took a look on his lectures on the aesthetics and also on religion, and then I came to the science of logics. And what I find very interesting, what is characterizing my approach, is that the tripartite structure of Anschauung, intuition, Vorstellung, representation, and Begriff, the concept, is, this is what he says, this is organizing the doctrine of the absolute. So Anschauung, intuition, is aligned with the arts. Repräsentation, Vorstellung, is the realm of the spiritual, of the religious thinking, and then we've got this concept as the realm of the philosophy. And this is very subjective, or these are subjective capacities too. So when he says in the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, for example, that it is all about understanding the substance also as subjective. So we have to have a framework which allows us to reflect the totality through subjective categories and kind of justify them on these grounds. So this is kind of the dialectical movement I see in place on its entire system. So the re-emergence of the subjective functions in organizing his doctrine of the absolute is not an accident. It's necessary, and I think it's a strength of his system. But if we come then to understand the relation of Anschauung, Vorstellung, and Begriff, the standard view is a hierarchy, right? The lowest capacity is the Anschauung, then we've got the representation, and finally, thankful, we reach at philosophy. And I mean, take my account for pluralism here just to be saying that this is not a hierarchy, but a plurality. So there are advantages and disadvantages of all these capacities being, let alone that Hegel is on the conceptual side of life. Yeah. So
is that a critique of Hegel, or are you saying that's what Hegel thinks?
Pardon?
Is that a critique of Hegel, or are you saying that's what Hegel thinks?
I coined this as a critique of secondary literature, but it needs to be spelled out in a clearer sense that Hegel does it on its own words. So it's a kind of, but this is a very idea that it's a critical relationship that we have. So this is where I come from. So it is different to think of the world on intuitive grounds, or see them as religious representations, or analyze them conceptually. And the most consequential way is the conceptual one. So to think things through, this is to think them conceptually. That's why I have this footnote, so to speak, on the indebtedness that I have to this reading of the 25 years between Kant and Hegel, because it is actually a proposition on how to understand logics as intuitive intellektuelle Anschauung, so intellectual intuition. So this is what we do when we apply logics. So I would not think of logics to be kind of ontologically separated, that we have a logics on nature, that we've got a logic on the spirit. Logics is rather a way of thinking about something. And this is counterintuitive to a certain point, because the intuition is pretty much stuck in the idea of the world as a totality consisted in items with properties. So this is what we see, right? We see these items, with all their dispositions and preferences. So thinking of the entire world just to be this. And then we start thinking logically, and we see, oh no, everything is, Heraclitus, right? Everything is only through constant change. So this is like kind of a snapshot, or kind of a moment of something that is in fluid, in change. So this is what we don't see, so to speak. We can only reach at this level by thinking. So logic is a way of thinking things to their very end. And so it's a way of, it brings about some alienation. So this is the critical relation between intuition and logic. So we can question, as I said, our own intuitions, the simplistic intuitions that we might have, thinking of the world as being constituted by objects with properties. This is simplistic, but we need logics to move beyond. And one of these ways of criticize or seeing more than we can intuitively see by criticizing our own simplistic assumptions. This is a very function of engaging in logics or in logical practices. So it's a sort of self-critique in the end of the day. And it's also self-critique of schematas. So simplistic conceptions, like the Verstand is delivering schematas. So in order to move the concept, we have to question our own schematas and, sorts of superficial understandings. And the method to do that, this is logic. So in the end of the day, logics is a form of transcendence, the realm of subjectivity. There we can kind of see our own finiteness through logic. So it's a very, it's a very broad understanding of logics, because
I think I see better what you're doing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So we have to wind up there because it's just gone the hour. So thanks, Toby.
Yes, I have to thank you.
We haven't got time for questions by people out there in Facebook land. Apologies. But we will be back next week for a wind up of the whole series. So if there's anybody out there in Facebook land who wants to tune in next week and put a question in on Facebook, then I hope we'll have time to discuss it then.
YouTube.
So
I should say, but it's okay.
So YouTube, sorry.
Whatever it is, whatever. Yeah.
Okay. All these companies run by the same people and do the same thing, so they kind of get run together in my mind.
No, it's
okay.
It's the old.
All right. So anyway, thanks again, Toby.
I'm very grateful. Thank you.
And
okay, thanks a lot.
Greg and Eleanor, if we just stay online, we'll think about how we want to handle next week.
Okay,
so
we'll see you guys later.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.
Okay.